So I just wanted to make a video talking about the Indo European religions, and why they're so interesting, and why they're so much better than the Abrahamic faiths. The Indo European religions are all the or most of the Christian faiths of Europe, and some of the earlier religions in the East too. These include the Greek religion, the Roman religions, and the religions of the Germanic peoples, people like Odin and Thor. And these guys all belong to the Indo European religious tradition. There's various people on the internet who want to sort of recreate these religions of their own traditions, pagans and neo-pagans, people like that. But unfortunately, it's very difficult to actually understand the Indo-European religions. You need to have a good grasp of the literature to actually get in there. As an example, this is a really good book, and you're going to see why these are so difficult to understand, these religions. This book is called How to Kill a Dragon by this guy, Calvert Watkins, from Harvard University. It's called Aspects of Indo-European Poetics, How to Kill a Dragon, and it's quite a large book. You can see it. It's all about Indo-European poetry and Indo-European societies. Now, trying to explain the Indo-European religions is a bit difficult. It's not kind of straightforward like with the Abrahamic faiths, where you can say to be a Christian you need to believe in this, or to be a Muslim you have to believe in such and such things. The Indo-European religions, they're all quite diverse, but they all have a common origin, and although they diverge away, and they become different religions even. If you think about Zoroastrianism, that's an Indo-European religion, but it's actually more similar to the Abrahamic faiths, having had a huge influence on the Abrahamic faiths. It's pretty much the same as the Abrahamic faiths in many ways, but it still has some Indo-European concepts, or very central Indo-European concepts in there. For instance, you can think about heaven in some versions of the Zoroastrian religion. Heaven is considered a house of song, so they call it the house of song. And if we actually look at Indo-European religions, this is a very important concept. Unlike the Abrahamic faiths, which are all written in prose, in a kind of straightforward philosophical type of language, the Bible, the Quran, and the Jewish literature, these are not in poetic form. They're not always in poetic form, and not generally in poetic form. The idea of poetry and song isn't really an important idea in the Abrahamic religion, but this is a central concept in the Indo-European faiths. Actually, if we look at the Indo-European religious literature, it's almost always in poetic form. It's never in the kind of rational philosophical form, or it's never actually prose. It's not straightforward speaking. It's always speaking in a poetic manner. That's why these books are really important, or this book is really important, because it actually tells you the nature of the poetry that they produce, the nature of the art that they produce, and you can actually look at that and try and get an understanding of what's going through their minds when they're producing this art. Now, when you think about the Abrahamic faiths, we tend to think in terms of, a belief. You got to have a belief. You got to believe in something. So for Christianity, you have to believe that there's one God, and there's afterlife, and that Christ was the Son of God, and he died for our sins. And for Islam is something quite similar to that. And once you believe those things, you kind of become a member of that religion. So those beliefs are central and define those religions. This is not really the case in the Indo-European religions. Now, for me, I consider myself an atheist to an extent, or at least compared to the Abrahamic peoples. Whereas the Abrahamic religions, for them, the importance is the idea of God and the belief in God, or one God, or the nature of God. This is not really an important concept in the Indo-European religions. Indo-European religions can exist without God, without gods. I believe that this is the case. Some people might disagree with me, but from my understanding of the Indo-European religions, the nature of the religion is more to do with art and songs and existence, and these other types of ideas that some people might consider these ideas metaphysical, but I prefer not to use that term. But it's more to do with the artistic expression and being able to produce things and create things, and being able to think in a certain manner. But that's not defined by a belief in a certain God. Now, me personally, I do understand quite a lot I think I understand quite a lot about the Indo European religions, um, like the pagan religions or the Vedic religion, but I don't really understand where the gods came from. Now, the best explanation I've come up with, or actually it's one which I've heard, is that these early Indo-Europeans, they were making songs and they're making poetry, and they started to talk about natural phenomena, things within nature, and they gave them a name. So they would give the sky a name. They might call it the father of the sky, or the sky father, or the light father, or Zeus Pater basically means the sky father or the light father. So they may have been writing songs, poetic constructions, metaphorical constructions, and when they refer to these entities or these phenomena, they sort of become like gods, or they become expressed in the poetic form, what you think of as a god, but it's not a literal belief in a god. Although I'm not sure if this is necessarily correct, but this is the only way which helps me to actually think, okay, where did this belief come from? Because I don't believe in this kind of Dawkins type of idea that people in the past were not that intelligent, so they just made up gods to explain natural phenomena, the so-called god of the gaps. I don't really believe in that idea. So for me, the early Indo-Europeans, they either believed in a god, or originally the idea was more to do with certain poetic formula, certain ways of describing the world and looking at the world and being part of the world, and expressing that in certain types of language, which is not a normal language. Now, in the Indo-European religions, we see this differentiation between normal language and poetic language. I think it's also the case when we look at English literature, like for instance Shakespeare. Certain characters in Shakespeare's plays, they speak in a more of a poetic language. They speak in meter, certain high characters or more noble characters, whereas the sort of average person or the more lowly person would speak in prose. In Indo-European literature, the idea of a song, or the idea of speaking in poetry, or being a poet, was extremely important and a founding idea within the religion. And the early Indo-Europeans also produced a lot of art, not just in the religion, but also in other aspects of their life. If we look at pagan peoples or pictures of them, or if we go to India or Afghanistan, we look at where people dress, it's quite well embellished and adorned. They have a lot of patterns, colors. When we go back further and further in the past into the Indo-European peoples, we see that their religion and their religious ideas and their non-religious ideas or their cultural ideas intersect quite a lot, and it's got a lot to do with beauty and artistic creation and things like that, rather than a kind of literal belief. So it's always going to be difficult to get back to this type of religion. You can't just get back to it. It needs to be reproduced, and this idea of reproducing it is also important. If we look at the Indo-European religions, they didn't actually have a certain strict static belief. They were always producing new literature and new ideas all the time, which is why we see it diverging quite a lot. Even in India, if we look at, we have the Vedic literature, which is a canon which has been preserved for quite a long time. This is the earliest layer of the Vedic religion, or the earliest layer of Hinduism. But even in Hinduism, it's changed quite a lot since then, and they've produced new literature time and time again to keep their religion relevant. And this is the same thing that you'd expect to see, and that we do see across the whole of the Indo-European world. The poems and the songs of the Greeks and the Germanic peoples and the Celtic peoples, they're all quite different, and they all get reproduced. And it's not like this one song or this one literature or this one statement or this couple of lines are the original, and we're always going to stick to that. But they always have to produce new stuff, because the truth isn't, for them, it wasn't like this is one thing which is we're going to stick to that. For them, it was everything, and it was everywhere. So they have to always produce it, and they have to always stay relevant. They were always producing new ideas, new songs, new arts, new products, new designs, and new cultures, new ways of living, because they have to keep up to date as the world changes around them. And when you have older religions, sometimes the society changes and the language changes, and these things don't stay up to date. So you need to re-express it. It's all about the expression. So in Indo-European religions, they're expressing certain things, but when things are around the person, when the society changes, when the language changes, the same ideas need to be expressed differently. So that's why you always get different types of songs, new things going on. And it's a really interesting line from some of the Vedic literature, where we have the poet singing to the god, and he says, "Oh, I made a new song for you today. I hope you like this new song." So there's always this thing where the Indo-Europeans like new things. They like tradition, but they also like new expressions and new ways of doing things. So it's something which needs to be considered for people who are looking at, going down the idea of paganism or Indo-European religions. It's not really the best way to just look at the past and try and recreate that, but you need to try and understand what these religions were about, and how that relates to the modern world, or how those ideas are best expressed or re-expressed in the modern world. And the idea of worshipping a god, or that's not really an important concept, as important as you might think. Although all Indo-Europeans did believe in gods, and I think that to get back into that type of mindset, or to understand it, we should think about, should leave the gods for later on, not try and get close to the gods or understand the gods, but try to understand the concepts of poetics and the idea of expression and expressing certain ideas. Think about things like meditation and flow and language. Things like that are much more important, because once you understand those things, then I think it's more easier to understand the concept of the gods, because that's the sort of intermediate between the two. And without understanding those things that are in the intermediate, you can't really move forward to the trying to understand the gods, if that's what you want to achieve. For me personally, I do consider myself a follower of the Indo-European religions to some extent, but I don't consider the idea of believing in a god or not god to be important. I see it more as an aesthetic idea, to do with morality and aesthetics and how things look and how they feel, and the fact that we as humans, we're all produced in a certain way, so we already have a kind of physical body which doesn't really change, and it's not actually objective. We're more subjective than we are objective. So these things are things like expression, things like that are a lot more important, and how people relate to certain things rather than just having an objective truth. There is a sense of objective truth in the Indo-European religions, and it's a very important concept, but it should be noted that the idea isn't quite the same as the kind of Abrahamic idea of objective truth, where they just say, oh, this is the objective truth and you have to follow this. It's more of a nuanced idea, and it relates to other things like language and poetry and arts and other types of things. So it's more important to understand the actual technicalities, the poetics, the arts, the type of items that we find in Indo-European traditions. In archaeology, we find a lot of things that are well adorned, well decorated. For instance, if we find swords from a Christian time, they're normally going to be just plain swords that they built 1,000 of them. They're all exactly the same. But when we find sort of similar items, swords from pagan times, they tend to be unique, and each one has got a lot of work done on it, a lot of artistic work, decorations, and they have a kind of mythological sense. They have the sword in a stone where only one person can take a stone out, and it says the sword out, and it's a special type of sword. It's not just any sword; it's a specific, special item. So the Indo-Europeans, they'd have this kind of idea of certain things that are special, things that should be adorned, things that should be made special. They didn't just believe in kind of this materialism that everything is the same. For them, everything had a character, and everything had some special value, personal value. This is my sword. I killed 100 people with this sword. It's a beautiful sword. This guy made it for me, and he's now dead. Nobody can make a sword like this. These are the sort of things, the type of connections that they have with items and with the physical world. Whereas in the sort of Christian world, and especially in the modern world, it's more materialistic, where we just have so many things that we don't actually have a connection with them. So I prefer, as an Indo-European, to kind of look at more handmade items. I prefer handmade things. I like things that are decorated. I like different designs. I think that's the best way to get into Indo-European, to surround yourself with artistic things. The Abrahamic religions and even atheism doesn't really have a strong understanding of art or aesthetics. And without those things, it's difficult to understand or talk about morality and objective scientific things too. They're kind of closely related. And there's many interesting discussions that we can have about this, but I think for now I might just leave it at this and maybe discuss other topics later on if anyone's interested in that. Do leave some comments if there's anything specific that you want me to talk about, because there's quite a few things that we can discuss in this area. One interesting thing that I wanted to mention is that some people talk a lot about ratio or logos. I think Jordan Peterson mentions this logos, and it's important to note that although this is Indo European concept, and one which was brought to the forefront by the Greeks. The Greek philosophers who actually believed in logos, they were actually called skeptics, so they actually moved away from the original Greek ideas, which was mythos. So we have this kind of dichotomy in Greek with mythos and logos, and mythos is the original sort of poetic or artistic idea, which is not literal, where things are explained in myth. But in logos, it's more prose, it's more philosophical, and I do believe that mythos, although in the Greek at that point it was probably degraded, so the philosophers moved away from it. But the idea of mythos is probably what I consider more to be Indo-European religion. Logos is an important concept, but the problem is that not everything can be defined in a straightforward, logical manner. So it needs to be understood that that as humans we're not purely logical. We also have emotions and feelings, and we have a certain subjective type of physicality that needs to be considered. And with mythos, these are different types of stories that transcend logic in a certain way. Logic is really simple, but life isn't as simple as logic. So people who think about logos as being a sort of central Indo-European concept, it's not actually central. It's more of a secondary thing, and mythos is more important in the sense that poetry is more important than prose.